Since the earliest records of human history, and probably before that, but certainly since the earliest Greek texts that we have, music has taken two distinct streams that I would like to talk about. One might be called the song of the earth, the music of the passions, of emotions, of joy and sorrow, the music of dance. The other I would call the voice of the sky. It is a very different kind of music. It is dispassionate, not expressive or emotional, but meant to evoke the realm beyond human existence and its joys and sorrows, the realm of the music of the spheres in ancient Greek thought, the cosmic and the eternal. I think that these same streams are present not just in Greek, but also in Chinese and in Indian texts. But I'm going to speak tonight mainly about the stream that runs through our Western music, and the examples that I will play will be from that. The first piece, the introductory Symphonia to Bach's cantata, Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit, I think is a wonderful example of the cosmic music. The text of the cantata concerns that God's time is the best time, and since the cantata is about death, it's preparing us for the moment in which we shall die and how we should understand that and prepare for it. Strangely enough, there's a kind of regular pulsation that you will have heard throughout it, which is almost exactly 1 second long, at least in the tempo that I've chosen. So there's a way in which it seems to be a music of time. And yet, I think if I've played it at all correctly, it should not suggest the passage of time so much as something that lies beyond it. One often hears it said that music is an art of time. I have my doubts about it, and I guess I would like to raise questions about that idea, because I think music, when it is functioning at its highest, suspends time, alters time in various ways, that changes it in ways that I'd like to explore through the pieces that I'm going to play today. To show you an example of music that contrasts the two streams that I've been talking about, the music of the sky, the music of the earth, the music of the spheres, and the song of the earth, I'd like to begin with a contemporary piece by Olivier Messiaen, the French composer who was one of the most important composers of the second half of the 20th century. It comes from a mammoth catalog of birds that he made over many, many years. He was fascinated with the song of birds and tried to capture them in his music, notating them at times as exactly as he could, given the limitations of the tempered scale with which the piano was working. The piece that I'm going to play now, which is called lulu, which means a woodlark, comes from this series of compositions. It concerns two birds. The first of them is the woodlark itself, a bird that doesn't exist in North America. Messiaen, in his notes to the performer, identifies it which as a voice that should sound almost unreal, as if it had fallen, he says, from the sky. The other bird that he's using is a much more familiar bird. It's the nightingale. And I had always thought, it's again a European bird, it doesn't really exist in North America. I had always thought from its literary associations that the nightingale would be a sweet, kind of otherworldly singer. That turns out not to be the case. The nightingale is, in his piece, the voice of the earth. It is raucous. To me, at times, it sounds more like the Roadrunner in the cartoons, or, to choose a less funny example, like Mockingbird, and maybe that's the closest example to it. It sounds raucous and shrill, it's virtuosic, it sings like the woodlark at night, but its music is completely different. Against both of them, as a kind of background for the composition, Messiaen places solemn and mysterious chords that he calls la nuit, the night. And the songs of the night are the background for both birds who both love to sing in the depths of the night. And Messiaen describes the music as trying to evoke the mysterious colors that are almost invisible and unnameable that one sees in the dark night sky. So in this composition, with the contrast of the two birds, we have not an ancient Greek, but a modern French example of these two different songs. The voice of the sky, the woodlark, and the voice of the earth. Messiaen has written a few lines because he notated the composition very exactly after a certain experience that he had in the mountains in rural France. And he's trying to describe, almost in a kind of ornithological way, the scene. Pine forest to the right of the road, pasture land to the left. From above, in the darkness, the woodlark tells its notes 2 by 2, chromatic and liquid descent. Hidden in a bush, a nightingale answers him. Contrast between the mordant tremolos of the nightingale and the mysterious voice of the heights. The woodlark, invisible, comes near, then more distant. The trees and the fields are black and calm. It is midnight.
This piece raises the question, I guess that's before me, is how is it that the music of earth and sky, of the timeless and the timeful are related? And this piece presents us with the question, the two birds singing to each other, against each other, certainly in the midst of the night that Messiaen so beautifully surrounds them with. The main part of this program is going to be devoted to three parts, three fugues from Bach's Art of the Fugue, which is his final work. The piece with which we began is one of his earliest works, written when he was in his 20s, astonishingly enough. This unfinished final piece, probably one of the most profound pieces of music ever written, raises in different ways the question of music and time and the different streams of music that we have in front of us, the expressive and the ecstatic or dispassionate. Bach began working on these series of fugues in the last decade of his life. It's one of the few pieces that he wrote really not for a commission or for the church or for a patron, but really for himself. It was part of a scientific work of his at the time, counterpoint was a science, and he was a proud member of a musical society formed by his student, Lorenz Meisler, to celebrate musical science. The creation of perfect crystalline works of art that existed in a way that was not dependent on human emotions. The Art of Fugue has one single subject that it uses throughout, which you'll hear at the beginning. I'll play three of the fugues. The first fugue is the fugue with which Bach begins, and it's called a simple fugue because, although like all true simplicity, it is anything but that. What is a fugue? A fugue is a subject, which is the central object, musical object. In this case, and then that subject is played against itself in four different voices. This would be called an entrance. Between these parts in which all four voices are singing one after the other, the main subject of the fugue, there are episodes which are more freely written, in which the composer exercises their fantasy on the musical development that's happened so far. There's also a counter subject, which you'll hear, which is played against the subject. And Bach will also work with that.
So this is the first fugue of the Art of the Fugue. You probably noticed the very sudden silences that he introduces at the end of this fugue, which I want to sort of dwell on for a moment. They're composed, and he even writes out how long the silence is to be. To me, it's very interesting, and it will come back when we do the last fugue in a few minutes, because this question of the relationship between music and silence is something that obviously interests him. It's not clear why he does this. Is it possible that he meant for the performer to improvise in between them. He was a famous improviser himself. He could improvise a 4-part fugue, which to me is almost unimaginable. And maybe at this point, maybe with a certain amount of irony, he was inviting the player. It somehow is a piece that's written to be played by oneself, for a few friends. It's scarcely a public utterance. But this moment, it's not clear whether he wants to invite us to put our own music in to see what should fill in the silence, or whether he's interested in the activity of the mind that's going to construct out of this, the seamless flow of what's preceded it, something else. So at any rate, I'd like to suspend that moment in particular. The next fugue I'd like to play is right exactly in the middle of the series. There are 14 of these fugues. Bach was very given to numerology, and his own name in this alphabet in which A equals 1, B equals 2, and so forth, I and J are the same letter, equals 14. There are 14 fugues in this collection, and this is now the 7th, so it's exactly in the middle of them. And it is built on the same subject, which now, by this point in the composition, Bach doesn't only use in this form, but also upside down. So you hear it in this fugue, both in its normal form and inverted. But what is more, and what I think is of particular interest, is that Bach is going to play this same subject at 3 different speeds. And to me, it raises the question of what does it mean to hear a piece of music not only in different speeds, by which I don't mean the tempo is the same, but the relative speed of them. You'll hear both. And then something that's twice as long. And then something 4 times as long. And so forth and so on. And he will interweave this throughout. And of course, not only using the subject in this form, but also inverted. And you'll hear that throughout this whole piece, which he calls these fugues contrapunctus, using a Latin word to somehow emphasize the learned and scientific quality of the work. He says, per augmentationem et diminutionem, through augmentation and diminution. Augmentation is stretching it out to twice as long, and diminution takes it twice as fast, so that it's bracketed on 2 sides. There's the middle-sized one, then there's the short one that's sped up by a factor of 2, and one that's slowed down by a factor of 2, so that there are 3 different speeds going on. To me, this constitutes a kind of an experiment in trying to find out what then is our relationship to time when we are hearing the same pitches at 3 different rates of speed. Surely time is not traveling at 3 different rates, or I don't know what is exactly happening, but it seems to me that at the very least time is being played with, if not suspended in some very radical way. So here's the contrapunctus 7, augmentation and diminution. last part of this fugue, at the point which corresponds in the first fugue to where the silences were, a kind of cadenza or last flourish. Perhaps you noticed that Bach kind of wrote it out. It was the part that went like this. He filled it out, whereas in the other fugue he left it more and allowed a silence to break there. In this fugue, I don't know how it seemed to you, but to me, the notes in a very, very long note values have a very different quality than when the theme is played in a shorter value. It's as if the notes in a more faster tempo seem to be more humanly understandable. They're more at the tempo of maybe human speech or human emotion. Whereas when they get slowed down by factors of 2 or 4, they have a very different character. It seems to me that here Bach may be playing with both the tremendous expressivity, because the music is very, very expressive in that earthly sense, but when it gets stretched out, it's as if he is aiming for or reaching for an effect that is far beyond the time scale at which we operate as human beings, and yet which is implicit in the music when it's slowed down. I think you'll notice the same quality in the final fugue that I'm going to play. This fugue wasn't really planned by Bach in the series. As I said, he had been working on these fugues for years during his last decade. During his the work was about to come out. It had been engraved in copper plates, and he suddenly had the idea for a 14th fugue. He had stopped, I guess, at 13, maybe a little afraid to introduce the number that was his own name. But in fact, he fell ill. He had an eye operation which was botched, which led to his death, blindness and death. During the process of he was trying at the same time to print this this work printed. As it was being prepared for the printer, he had an ideal for a final fugue that would be, I suppose, a fugue to end all fugues, or at least to end his fugues. It was to be a quadruple fugue. What that means is that it has 4 different subjects. The last subject was going to be this same subject that we've been working with in the other 2 fugues. The first subject that you'll hear in this series of fugues is a kind of solemn, it's similar, it's related to this, but it's not the same. It goes like that, and it has very long note values. And I bring it forward here to suggest that by virtue of its long, sustained quality, it is aiming for something more than expressivity. The second of the fugues, and these are all pulled together, has a kind of running subject that to me seems almost autobiographical. So it runs and speaks. It has the quality of life itself, and there is a kind of, as a result of its greater internal motion, it has a different kind of expressivity than the rather austere first fugue, which is, Bach would have said it's in the ancient style, the stile antico, of long sustained notes that he was working in. The third fugue is based on his own name. B-A-C-H in German is B flat, A, C, and H is B natural. So this rather chromatic subject is his own name, which he introduces after what I've called this sort of autobiographical section. I don't have a good reason for that. But I guess I do in the sense that after that, he feels that he's going to sign his work in a very extraordinary and unprecedented way by treating his own name in musical notes. And he develops this, and I should add that in each of these fugues, they're not separate from each other. He will, for instance, in the second of these 4 interlinked fugues, he will start to introduce the original subject. And the third involves the first and the second. And presumably the fourth, which he never got to, would have involved all of them together. But, as you will hear, this third fugue breaks off, and in the manuscript, his second eldest son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, wrote, at this point in the manuscript where the composer's name enters in the counter subject, he died. So this very extraordinary passage is, I suppose, the moment, if not of Bach's death, the elder Bach's death, but of his death as a composer. It is an extraordinary, perhaps unique, artistic work in which the final moment, or at least the final moment of creation of the composer is recorded. It's probably the most shocking moment in music, and wanted to prepare you for it. The manuscript breaks off, and his heirs weren't sure what to do. But on his deathbed, in his blindness, it is said that Bach dictated a chorale prelude to his son-in-law. The chorale prelude, "Vor deinem Thron trete ich hermit," when I come before your throne. And it's clear that he lived on past the point where he dropped the pen and couldn't continue the fugue itself. But he was then able somehow, the story goes, to dictate a chorale prelude that would be his last utterance. And when they published The Art of the Fugue, Bach's heirs included this as a way of, as they said, compensating people for any annoyance that they might have of not having the last fugue completed. And I will go on to play it without any kind of break.